BLM. Brenda Shierts is from the Delphouche BLM. And Doug Melton is from the Miles City BLM. And they're going to be talking about fossil finds in South Dakota.
Thanks, Diana. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brenda Shierts. I'm the BLM archaeologist, paleontologist, tribal liaison. Once in a while I'll answer the phones. I usually don't get them transferred very well. And anything else they need, I help with the fires. We have a very small office here in South Dakota, and that is located up in Delphouche. And since it is such a small office, we kind of all pitch in and help out with everything that we need. My background is I went to school for anthropology, and most of my career followed in archaeology. And I started out in the Midwest. I'm a Minnesota girl, East River. And I did a little bit of archaeology around the Midwest for a few years, and then I come out to South Dakota. Oh, I think it's been 21 years ago, just to spend a couple of years here and find out what Plains archaeology was like. And then I met a cowboy, and he's from Faith, got married, and here I am. Never quite moved on. So I've been very fortunate with my career. I worked for NRCS for a few years. I was based out of Pierre, and I had North and South Dakota. I spent 5 years with the state of South Dakota, primarily doing DOT surveys. That was my first 5 years in the state. So I got to know South Dakota really, really well. I worked all over the entire state. And then NRCS was next, and then I moved on to the Forest Service, and I spent 10 years on the Northern Hills out of the Spearfish office, and I've seen more historic prospect pits in the hills than I could ever count. And from there I moved on to the BLM probably about 7 years ago now. So it was nice to go back. It was nice to go to the BLM from the Forest Service just so I could get a little bigger piece of the pie for the archaeology, and I could get back to doing a little bit more prehistoric, and had a great variety. And then they gave me the paleontology hat and all my other hats, and so I am a self-taught paleontologist. I took one geology class in college. That's as close as I ever got to any formal education in it. But fortunately for me, I've had mentors like Doug Melton here, and we have our own BLM state paleontologist. His name's Greg Liggett. He's taught me an awful lot also, and I've been fortunate enough to work with some great professionals that are out there in paleontology. There's professors from the University of Manchester in England. He's come over quite a few times and worked on BLM lands up in Harding County. There's a professor from the University of Cincinnati that's come out numerous times with North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana. So I've had a lot of training, and most of it's been in the field, and that's much better. As far as I'm concerned, you learn an awful lot faster when you're on the ground and actually looking at things than what you could pick up with your degree. So anyway, today I want to share a little bit about the resources that we have here in South Dakota. And the BLM kind of has a hidden treasure here in South Dakota that not a lot of people are familiar with, and maybe more people are familiar with it than I know. But it's not something that that is real well advertised. And the BLM was fortunate enough to be able to take over this site. So I'm going to go grab this box right here, and I want to see if anybody can recognize what's in the box. Does this look familiar to anyone? And I will have to set it down because Doug's smart enough to do casts of his fossils. I don't grab the real darn thing. Anyway, that is what we call a fossil cycad. And the BLM was fortunate enough to take over a site in South Dakota down by Hot Springs called the Fossil Cycad National Monument. Now, a fossil cycad, let's see if I can take this off. Fossil cycads. Does anybody know what a fossil cycad is? They're considered a dinosaur tree. They are a palm-looking tree that we had prior to the dinosaurs and that are still in existence today. Fossil cycads, there's some examples up here on the board, and I know it's difficult to see the board, but you can come by and take a look at it later. But in a nutshell, they're a plant with a very large crown, and they had big stout tree trunks, and they were a flowering plant. And they figured that they first appeared about 300 million years ago, and that was prior to the dinosaurs. They existed during the dinosaur time. It's what we think a lot of the plant-eating dinosaurs were eating, like the brachiosaurs, apatosaurs, stegosaurs, triceratops. I picked all the ones I could pronounce. I'll be honest. And these plants continue to live or exist today. The world distribution for the cycads that we have now, they're usually in the subtropics and tropical climates. So they're around, South and Central America, northern parts of Africa. They're over by Australia, anywhere that we have a tropical type climate. Cycads of South Dakota. Down by, on your way to Hot Springs, Highway 18, we have what is called, or was called, the Fossil Cycad National Monument. And numerous cycad specimens, which is like the one I just brought over, have been discovered there and excavated there. The BLM, our state paleontologist, Greg Liggett, he wrote up a little historic background on the Fossil Cycad National Monument. And F.H. Cole of Hot Springs, he first discovered the cycads in 1892. The first description of the locality and the fossils was published by a gentleman by the name of Professor McBride, and he was at the University of Iowa. That was in 1893. Lester Ward of the USGS started collecting in that region, and then George Reber Weiland became interested in the cycad sites of South Dakota. Professor Weiland, he was from the University of Yale. He published 2 volumes on the fossil cycads of South Dakota, discovered that this particular species or type of cycads was so rare. It's one of the only types or species of its kind in the world. Weiland wrote, the Minnetonka locality, or the fossil cycad, is easily the most striking in the whole world, both as to the number of trunks, the variety of form, and the interest of the conserved floral types. So, in layman's terms, it was a rare species, and we had it right here in South Dakota, and we had a lot of them. Weiland obtained the land under fossil cycad under the Homestead Act just to protect the site. 2 years later, he offered to return the land to the federal government, and in 1922, Fossil Cycad National Monument was established as a unit of the National Park Service. This right here is their logo that they had prepared for when they designated the National Monument. And these pictures up here, when you come up, there's a picture of Professor Weiland, and there's also a picture of Professor McBride. The monument, I believe, was 320 acres, and it is the same shape as what the BLM acquired today. So the BLM has the monument in its entirety. And this is what they had proposed for the monument at one time. If you come up here, you can see they had parking areas, they had a museum planned, they had excavation pits planned, they had great plans. Well, unfortunately, now this was in the late 1800s. Unfortunately, by 1930s, the fossils exposed on the surface were depleted. What happened was, word got out, Professor Weiland published, paleontologists found out, locals found out, I mean, people from outside the area found out, and everybody started taking the cycads. The paleontologists took tons off of the site and sent them all over the world to different museums and different places to study. So by the 1930s, the fossils that were exposed on the surface were depleted, and that was after years of unauthorized fossil collecting. In November 1935, another 1 ton of specimens were collected at the monument and taken to Yale. So I don't know if Professor Weiland at that time thought, boy, I better get what's left, or I don't know what he was thinking. At any rate, despite the efforts of the Park Service, despite his efforts with the Park Service, and to interest congressional officials, the monument was not developed with the visitor center or any kind of educational interpretation. By the early 1950s, advocates for the fossil cycad National Monument had all passed away. And with all of the obvious surface resources having been removed or stolen, the National Park Service wished to get it off their paper. So a bill was passed by Congress and signed into law August 1st, 1956 to turn the land over to the BLM, or the Bureau of Land Management. So much for the great dream, so much for the great site, so we thought. Then, around 1980, the DOT decided they had to reroute their highway. Well, they decided to reroute the highway right through the Fossil Cycad National Monument. In 1980, they started construction on the highway. They built a superhighway as you know it now. And where they put it through Fossil Cycad National Monument, guess what? Lo and behold, they started digging up fossil cycads. Well, as we are told by some of the workers that worked on the highway, they would set the fossil cycads alongside the highway and just line them up out there as they found them. And by morning, they would all disappear. So, once again, word got out, people found out the fossil cycads were still there, and who knows where the majority of them went, unfortunately. Up here on this board, I've just got a few pictures of some of the construction. I apologize, it's not the best quality, but then I've got a couple of newspaper articles up here too about the new discoveries of the fossil cycads. They did publish newspaper stories, they did let the word out, which I don't know if that was the best thing or not. But fortunately for us, I think it says there was, I can't remember the exact amount, but at least a ton of fossils that were brought to the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. So they are still being housed there in a collection. And fortunately, you know, we were able to keep some of them here in South Dakota. So fossil cycad, once the BLM found out that we still had fossil cycads there, they went ahead and designated the monument as what the BLM calls an area of critical environmental concern and an area of relative ecological importance. And what that means is, basically we took the entire 320 public surface acres, we designated them as an ACEC, as we call it. Sorry, we feds, we all talk in acronyms, but that's Area of Critical Environmental Concern. And what we did then is we were able to provide restrictions for that area. So we've got visual resource management restrictions, we got air quality, we closed the area to oil and gas exploration and saleable gravel, any kind of gravel mining, any kind of mining, surface mining. And we are in the process of doing a mineral withdrawal for any of the subsurface minerals, hard rock mining. Our present management, we're trying to kind of emphasize it as low profile. We plan to put a sign up that shows or talks about the fossil cycad national monument and what was, but we haven't decided if we're going to put it right on site or if we're going to maybe put it at a pull-off along the highway, a little bit further up the road. And that's just because of its history. We also, we just finished our resource management plan in South Dakota, and we also put in there that we closed it to any kind of surface collecting or any kind of fossil collecting. So we're hoping what's there we can protect until down the road, see if somebody wants to develop it again or do some more excavating. But for now, we just want to protect it. There's cattle grazing that is allowed. They're not bothering anything. I've been down there to look. And we've got a couple of permittees. They're landowners that have land adjacent that have the allotment, the range allotment that are grazing, and they are wonderful people. They keep a really close eye over everything that happens out there. So anyway, some of the fossils, we had a fossil conference here in South Dakota at the School of Mines a couple years ago. And we've got a gentleman that's out in DC that works for the National Park Service, and his name is Dr. Santucci. Did I say that right, Doug?
I think so.
Okay. Anyway, he's taken it upon himself to write the story of Fossil Cycad National Monument, and he has found boxes and boxes and boxes of information and articles on studies that have been done on these fossil cycads throughout time. And he found those in the basement of one of the National Park Service buildings in DC. Since then, he's taken it upon himself to publish as much information as he possibly can on the Fossil Cycad National Monument. And I do have a few of his write-ups. If anybody's interested, let me know afterwards, and I'll take down your name and get those to you. But he's also, in the meantime, when we had our conference, all of these paleontologists started coming out of the woodwork and saying, oh, I've seen fossil cycads at this museum. I've seen fossil cycads at this museum. And lo and behold, we've got cycads from South Dakota in Iowa State University, Peabody Museum of Yale, American Museum of Natural History in New York, United States National Museum, which is Smithsonian to us, the Journey Museum in Rapid, the South Dakota School of Mines. We found out the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology, which is in Drumheller, Alberta, Canada, has some of the fossil cycads from South Dakota, and the British Museum of South Kensington, and the Natural History Museum in Vienna, Austria. So they have made their way across, basically across the world. And we're hoping, to find more as Mr. Santucci does more of his publishing. So anyway, just real quick, does anybody know why fossil cycads would be of interest? What's so great about a fossil cycad, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I thought, for the majority of fossils, when you talk about fossils, you usually think right away of dinosaurs. But I guess what I think is interesting about the cycads there's an article that was written here by Kate Cyber, and I do have a couple extra copies of this, but she basically talks about what Mr. Santucci is doing and what he's pulling together and the articles that he's writing on it. But in her write-up, she basically states, because the cycads were petrified, in many cases, they were replaced with silica, and much of their internal anatomy was fossilized. And sometimes that was at near cellular level. So, and this was a statement made by Mr. Kirk Johnson, a paleobotanist who's a director at the Smithsonian's National Museum. This allows paleontologists to study them with the resolution that could be applied to living plants. And that is a very rare level of preservation. So, other information that they can glean from studying these fossilized plants are more or less, they can find out the diets of the dinosaurs that we are so interested in. And not only are the dinosaurs studied, their coprolites are studied. And Doug's going to touch a little bit more on coprolites, but coprolites are petrified poop. And there are paleontologists out there that study coprolites. So once you study the coprolites, you can find, we're hoping that they can put the fossil cycads together with the coprolites. But I'm going to let Mr. Melton take over, and he's going to talk a little bit more on the critters that were eating these. And please look me up afterwards and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I get you to
Yep.
run the projector.
I can sure do that. I'm just going to move this over a little bit.
Get started. My name's Doug Melton. I'm the lead archaeologist for the BLM in Miles City, but I also have a background in paleontology. My dad was a curator of the geology department at the University of Montana.
Hold the mic a little closer.
Okay. My dad was the curator of the geology department. He's also a resident paleontologist and had worked throughout the West. Although, interestingly, he didn't like dinosaurs, so he concentrated on other aspects of vertebrate paleontology. I remember being hauled out to look at tertiary mammals. One of my first experiences in archaeology was actually crawling around in a cave with Pleistocene fauna. Arctodus, the giant short-faced bear, mammoth, longhorn bison, and a projectile point and some lithics that they found. Anyways, my presentation is the big and the tall and the small. Most people, when they think of the Hellcrick Formation, tend to think of dinosaurs. But there's much more to the Hellcrick Formation than just dinosaurs. Next slide. First, let's think about what are fossils. I mean, there are a whole bunch of things that are considered fossils. Plants, invertebrates, vertebrates, some single-celled organisms. Blue-green algae is a real good example, called stromatolite. Occasionally people will think viruses if they can find them in the fossil record, which is odd because to me it really does look like a rock when you're talking about that. But things like foraminifera, things. But they can also include things that aren't parts of animals but are associated. These include trackways, gizzard stones, gastroliths, which are those real rounded rocks you think that they thought kind of act like chicken, and other fowl that do that. Coprolites, which Brenda's already pointed out, but burrows, and in parts of Montana it would also include fossil nests. I don't think they've found those in South Dakota yet, but they don't tend to be common in the Hellcrick Formation, but they do tend to be relatively common in the Judith River Formation. Or they're not common, but they've been found in several places. And they can also be related to the ancestors of living creatures. Things like, there's always the big debate on whether or not birds are actually a form of dinosaurs, things like that. Next. That's a trackway. That's actually kind of a reverse trackway from, I'm thinking, a T-Rex. But that actually is, interestingly, because it's, instead of the negative imprint, it's actually a positive imprint. The mud formed around it rather than squishing into the mud. Next. These are the gastroliths. These are all from probably over in the, I think in the Pryor Mountains. They're actually out of the Morrison Formation. It's a little earlier Cretaceous formation, but you do find these occasionally in the Hill Creek Formation. Like, again, they think they were related to aiding in digestion, but there's some question about that. Not all of them are rounded and things. Next. And there's coprolites. This one is actually a piece of from a T-Rex is what they figure. It's full of bone, small pieces of bone, other things. That one, I can't remember if it's a Triceratops or a Hadrosaur. But that would be one that would have plants in it, things like that. They actually will form. I've actually seen them much older than this. I grew up working in a place called the Bear Village, which is a fossil fish area, and they would actually explode within the animal, and you'd see bits and pieces of bone that you never see before and things like that. Next. Okay, this is an example of a living form. What do you think that is? Exactly, it's a bison. How old do you think that bison is? That bison is about 20,000 years old. It's been radiocarbon to 19,990 plus or minus 70 years, so roughly 20,000. It actually came from a coulee over north of Ritchie, Montana. The only reason I know it's 19,990 is I described it in a paper with another archaeologist named Les Davis. Next. Okay, how old are fossils? Some of the oldest fossils are blue-green algae, and that little note that says cut through cabbage, that actually is what a geologic professor of mine told us, that if you, to make a stromatolite, you can cut through a head of cabbage, put it up right side up, or so the part you cut through is up, add some food coloring, and you've got a stromatolite. That's about what they look like. They're found over by Glacier Park. They're actually Cambrian. The Cambrian period is one of the oldest, the first period of multi-celled animals, and they sort of start involving, dinosaurs appear in the Triassic, which is fairly old, about 220 or so million years ago. I'm going to concentrate on the end of the dinosaurs for most of the rest of this. So, next slide. This is one of my favorite Cambrian fossils. This is from a place called the Burgess Shale in the Canadian Rockies. The genus name for that is Hallucinogenia. The next slide will show you why. That's what they figure it looked like. All right, next slide. And really, I'm going to talk, and everybody see, I'm really going to talk about the Cretaceous period, which is in the Mesozoic to Jurassic. Most of the Jurassic Park movies actually have fauna that's from the Cretaceous rather than Jurassic. Things like T-Rex, Hadrosaurs, the raptors, those all come from this period. And really I'm going to talk about just the upper part of this before it goes into the Tertiary period and the Fort Union Formation, which is usually called the Paleocene. The Eocene is known as the explosion of mammals, and they take on all kinds of different shapes and sizes. And here in South Dakota, that's probably best seen in the White River Formation, and a little bit in the Rickery Formation. Next. This is a kind of a map of, this is the Miles City Field Office, the geologic map. This dark green is the Hell Creek Formation. You can see it doesn't go everywhere. This would be the Musselshell River. This is the Yellowstone. This is called the Cedar Creek Anticline that extends down into South Dakota. This is over towards, that would be over towards Ekalaka. This is sort of about the county line between Powder River and Carter County. the Hell Creek Formation actually extends further east into both South and North Dakota. Next. And this is some of the things. Unfortunately, I can't get this slide to reduce down, but my point here is that basically you have a lot more than just dinosaurs coming out of the Hell Creek. You have fish. You can't barely see it over there. You have salamanders. You have frogs. You have snakes. You have crocodiles. You have what they call chomsosaurs, which look like a alligator. Next. Fish. Just to give you an example, we tend to deal on a sort of a massive scale with paleontology in the Miles City field office. We have over 6,000 reported paleontological localities. It's probably up to about 9,000 now. Most of the reported localities, people, when they tend to work in the Hell Creek, they tend to focus on dinosaurs, but they will also focus on what they call microsites, which have a variety of critters with them. I would think the same would be true that dinosaurs are reported from many eastern Montana counties. They're probably also reported from many western South Dakota counties where the Hell Creek is exposed. Harding County is probably the best example that I can think of. There are hot spots in Garfield County, Carter County, and Macomb County where you get, not only do you get the Hell Creek Formation, you also get the overlying formation of the tertiary period, which begins the age of mammals. So they tend to concentrate in most paleontologists tend to concentrate in those areas. And almost all the dinosaurs, there's a few exceptions. There's a couple of dinosaurs that come from where the Jurassic Judith River Formation is exposed. And sometimes you will see the Hell Creek Formation referred to as the Lance Formation. It's actually, its type locality is in Wyoming. And that's sort of where that is, and I think there's actually a move back now by geologists and paleontologists to call it the Lance Formation. Although everybody says it's equivalent. The Hell Creek Formation was first identified in Montana, north of Jordan, by where the first T-Rex came from, by a guy named Barnum Brown, who was a professor at the American Museum of Natural History, who came out actually at the request of one of Dion's predecessor offices, the General Land Office, had found some fossils up near a place called Porcupine Dome, and they had sent them to him, so he went out to look there and then moved on over to where the first T-Rex is. Next. This gives you an idea of the people who've worked in eastern Montana, and almost all of these people have also worked in South Dakota. At one point. Some of the bigger names, Berkeley, Yale, the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian is still active in Fallon County, just across the border, and in, I think it's Bowman County, just across the border in North Dakota as well. That's actually the gentleman Kurt, the paleontologist you talked about, Brenda?
Yeah.
Yeah, he comes out and is a big plant guy.
I have a little bit of catching up to do.
It's surprising. I mean, it's
Wow.
the number of people. Some of them were permitted, others were not. Next slide. That's an admonosaur. Do anybody know what kind of dinosaur generally that's called? Other than Brenda. It's a duck-billed dinosaur. This is probably the most common of the duck-billed dinosaurs in the Hell Creek Formation. Next. This is actually an admonosaur being excavated. This is the pelvis. On top, the pelvis is right here. And beneath that is the skull. This is the vertebral column and legs. Next slide. Kind of give you an idea of what that looks like pulled apart. This is actually a dinosaur named Nancy. One thing about paleontologists, they seem to name all of their finds. So you'll have Nancy, we've got a Fred, a Thomas, Homer, which is an example of this. This is from the Homer site. Pearl, which is a small raptor, which is described to us as a chicken on steroids and an attitude. Next. This is actually what they found. The red is the actual bones they found. So you can see they're missing a few of the toes, part of the limb bone, part of the radius and ulna in the front. Okay, next. This, of course, is the Triceratops. This is actually a brow horn from a cast of a brow horn from a Triceratops. Triceratops are probably the most numerous fossil dinosaur in the Hell Creek. I think of them as the cows of the Cretaceous. Next. This is actually what one looks like, a fossil. This is the lower jaw of one. And it's about what you usually find them looking at. This was actually in pieces. You can see where they've had to wire it together to keep it all in one piece. Next. This is another type of Triceratops called, this is probably a Torosaurus, which is the biggest Triceratops. This is the one that they think what adults got to. It had big holes in the frill. But this is all the last piece. This was actually reported to us as Triceratops maximus. The gentleman lying there, he's 6 feet tall. Give you an idea of the size, the length of that, and the skull would actually go back to about here. So it has one of the largest skulls known to paleontologists. Next. Of course, this is probably the most well-known dinosaur of all. T-Rex. T-Rex occurs, they found him in South Dakota? I believe so. Oh, yeah.
Yep, we have Sue.
We have Sue, that's right. I always get that, for some reason I think that's North Dakota. Yes, you do have Sue, you have a couple others. Generally we find pieces. One of the most complete ones came from off of the Fort CMR Russell, Charles and Russell Wildlife Refuge. That's actually went back to be on display in the Smithsonian. Jack Horner spent about 2 years flying around in a helicopter trying to find one off of public land so he could take it to the Smithsonian. He was very successful. Next. This is a juvenile T-Rex. This is known as Jane. Jane, the next slide has some facts about Jane. Oh, no. This is actually her skull. This is actually a puncture mark caused by another T-Rex. Jane is kind of controversial. They're not sure if she's a new genus or a juvenile T-Rex. Most people now think a juvenile T-Rex, but some people still hold that it's a new genus because the number of teeth change. She has more teeth than a typical T-Rex. Some people think they use crocodiles as an analogy, that as crocodiles get older and larger, they actually reduce the number of teeth they have. Next. This is some Jane facts. This is right about the end of the Cretaceous, about 66 million years ago. About 21 feet long. Probably weighed 1,500 pounds as compared to a full-size T-Rex, which weighed considerably more. They've found a few more of Nanotyrannus pieces, but they have not found anything that's quite equivalent to Jane. We have a copy of her, a cast of her skull, in our office as you walk in the door. Next, I think the other cast is in Montana, is in Ecolaka. This is Pachycephalosaur, the dome-headed dinosaur. This is the one you always see people have reproductions of them headbutting. Although paleontologists now have taken a little more careful look at that and realize that they wouldn't be able to do that without essentially causing themselves severe harm and a nasty headache. We find it in pieces. Next. Sometimes it gets confused with Paracephalosaurus, which has the big dome going out the back. We do find pieces of it, but we've not found a complete one, at least that I'm aware of, in Montana or South Dakota. or anywhere else for that matter. It's usually been pieces. And as for the colors of the dinosaurs and books and things, they're sort of an artist's idea. They think they mimic birds somewhat. You have the feathered dinosaurs that actually have feathers. They think those might have been colored. But I actually asked Phil Manning about that, who's probably the world's expert on dinosaur skin impressions and things. And he said, really, we don't know. You really can't get the melatonin that you would need to actually be able to tell that. Next. And of course, we have Ankylosaur. This is supposedly the dinosaur, big armor, had a brain in its head and a brain in its tail. People argue about that, but it is. And again, you tend to find more these scutes, pieces of plate, rather than the whole critter. There's a few known, and there's enough pieces known that they could sort of put a composite of it together. But really, I can't think of any complete ones out of the Hell Crypt that I'm aware of. Next, like I say, they do show up on a fairly regular basis. Next. This is Thessaliosaur. It's kind of a small dinosaur. Actually, Thessaliosaur loosely translates as wonderful neglected lizard. Basically, the person who found it said, well, boy, this is a neat dinosaur. You know, you do find pieces of it. We have a cast of a leg also in hanging in our office. You able to see? Okay. Anyways, they're not sure if they ran in packs or not. Usually you find more pieces of this. You find a lot of pieces of this at in microsites. So we think they were probably scavenging. Is probably the best way to put it. Next. This is sort of some of the non-dinosaur fauna. This guy is a Brachiochompsosaur, which is kind of, probably the best way to describe it is an alligator. Looks a lot like an alligator. The snout particularly is nice, big and round. This is from over between Powderville and Ekalaka. He's about 3 feet, a little over 3 feet long. This is actually probably his actual size. He's an adult. Found it took him about Berkeley Museum of Natural History about 3 years to excavate this. They found pieces of it. There's another alligatoid or a crocodilian called Chompsosaur that looks at that. And then you also have true alligators and true crocodiles in the fauna as well. Next. This, what do you think that is? I'll give you a hint. This is its skull. Exactly. Somebody got it. It's a turtle. It's a turtle. It's a soft-shelled turtle from a place called the Ninja Turtle site. Let me see if I can get on this side. This is the head. You can see the feet coming out, the front foot. This is the actual shell. There's about now I think there are about 24 turtles from this locality. Next. These are fossil mammal teeth and bones from a fossil mammal called Didelphodon, which was usually described as something looking like an opossum, and Didelphodon, and possums or didelphins. This one's a little different, and actually the best example is known from here in South Dakota. They really didn't know, like I say, most pictures used to sort of look like a possum. That if you hit the next slide. This is what sort of the recreation looks like. The scientific description of this is a face of a Tasmanian devil made into an otter. This is actually one of the bigger Cretaceous mammals. It would have been about 3 feet long and about 2 feet tall. Like I say, the best example, it took them 2 years to piece this together from the bones they had from the site. microsite, I believe, in Harding County. Next. This is sort of a, when I set this up, I did this for teachers. So, some information on where you can go find more information on the Hell Creek. Models are always a good way for teaching. University, a good source of information. But basically, I set this up for grade school and preschool teachers, so sort of where they might be able to find some more information. Next. There is a thing in Montana, I just glimpsed at there, called the Dino Trail, which basically you get a passport and you go to the various museums to get stamped. They have just different kinds of dinosaurs in different places. What do dinosaurs look like? Probably the first thing is a lot of times they're hard to tell from the surrounding rock. Not all the time, but sometimes. More often than not, they're in little bitty pieces. You don't usually tend to find complete bones. You basically find them and need to put them back together. There may be some slight color differences, and that usually clues you in, and they can vary in size from small flakes to complete bones, or the complete skeleton. It's pretty rare you find a complete skeleton in one place. Next. This is actually the former district manager working on a Triceratops site. We were out on a public tour, maybe I'll just stand over here, for the Burpee Museum of Natural History. This is actually some rib bones, and I think there's some long bones back here and some vertebrae. I try to get people out on a regular basis from our office just to sort of give them exposure to what goes on. The Burpee Museum is out of Rockford, Illinois, and they've been very good, very nice to us for allowing us to tag along occasionally. I think the most people I had on one of these was 70. Yeah. I also encourage people to bring their kids on these because kids actually are much sharper when it comes to dinosaurs than a lot of adults. And it's surprising that they can pronounce all those names.
Oh, yes.
Next. This is kind of a rarity. There's a complete ulna radia of a Triceratops, kind of just exposed right on the surface. Another little chunk of the bone. No, that's actually a rock. This this doesn't happen very often. This is actually from a place called the BK, and they told me they had to call it the Shake and Bake site. The two people who found it. Next. This is actually from the same site. That's a femur of a hadrosaur. That's kind of more, basically it's not even this good anymore. You can barely recognize it as bone. It's all been split by weathering. I had a couple of paleontologists look at me and they just go out to look at it for me. And they said, well, really we can't do much with this. And these are there's a whole group of other things called pseudofossils. These are called pseudofossils. This is a concretion. This is one of those big round rocks you find of sandstone. This is kind of split in two. This is a piece of sandstone. You can notice it has kind of a bone-like structure, but it really doesn't have anything. This is kind of a split geode. That's kind of a split concretion or a geode that kind of shows things. People will actually do this, try to make them fossil eggs. This is called a septarian nodule. Next. This is kind of a close-up of the septarian nodule. And you can see what would you think that might look like otherwise?
An egg.
An egg, or this is really sort of, looks a lot like a turtle shell. And a lot of people will actually bring them in and say, I have a turtle. And you have to explain to them, no, this is really a septarian nodule. And it's a piece of ironstone this one has some limonite in it, and a lot of them do. But sometimes will make it even look more shell-like. Brenda has some examples of turtle scutes there, and a lot of people will think this is just kind of a very darker version of that. Next. These are some other examples of pseudofossils. This is a piece of sandstone. You know, that really does look like a bone. This is kind of one that looks like a tooth. It's another sandstone formation that has a little piece going down. It's nicely crowned, and a lot of teeth look like this. This actually is a fossil, but it's not the fossil that you expect. This is algae, but actually if you look at this carefully, it looks like a vertebra. And actually people have brought these in and said, I've got a vertebra, this would be the centrum, the base of it. And you have to carefully explain to them, well, not really, but next. And then Brenda also hit on this, why study fossils? They're used for telling us about geologic conditions, both in the past and assisting us in the present. And they also talk about, also lets us know about interconnectedness of the Earth. Some of the fossils, Cretaceous fossils that occur here occur elsewhere in the world. And also, probably the biggest thing is how they help us understand environments and how they change. Next. This is kind of an example for us. Miles City, the BLM office in Miles City, which is pretty much the eastern third of Montana, issues about 10 to 15 permits a year. These are the people who were working here last year. The Cleveland Museum, I can never remember what it's called. It used to be the Cleveland Museum of Natural Science. Now it's something else. Same building. Concordia College, which is out of Moorhead, Minnesota. Museum of the Rockies, not so much anymore. They actually put their people on other people's groups. The Burpee Museum of Natural History. They've been a really good group to work with. They also work with Northern Illinois University. The University of Washington, the Burke Museum. They specialize more in microsites. They're not really big into dinosaur excavation. Mostly two things. One is it takes a lot of logistics to actually get one off the ground and successfully taken out of the ground. And Greg, I don't remember what his last name is. Anyways, he's more interested in the small stuff and how those change through the Cretaceous. One of the interesting things about parts of Montana and actually South Dakota is you have a pretty good limit, a pretty good exposure that shows the whole Cretaceous rather than just the top. Carter County Museum, which is probably one of the small Carter County museums, but the person who's a curator is actually working on his PhD in USC right now. University of Kansas in Garfield County, they're working on a site that has actually a Torosaurus. It's one of the few that we know of. St. Louis Community College works with them. The Denver Museum of Science and Nature, this is actually Tyler Leeson, who most of you may know, or a lot of you may know, who works out of just north of the border in North Dakota. And the Dinosaur Discovery Museum out of Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is also Carthage College. Works with a guy named Tom Carr, who's one of the leading experts in tyrannosaurs and tyrannosaur biology and morphology. Next. And of course, this is a question we get asked a lot as federal archaeologists and people who deal with paleontology. What can I collect? On the federal and state lands, permits required. I think it's probably the same for North Dakota. I know this is true for Montana. I assume it's the same for South Dakota. Permits are issued by the Land Management Agency, and some of those may be different by agency. The Forest Service has a little different requirements than we do. The Corps of Engineers has a little different. Although we're working now, 2009, as part of the Omnibus Public Lands Bill, they passed a section in that dealt with paleontological resources protection. And that, basically, we're working with the Park Service and Bureau of Reclamation and BLM to come up with a standardized set of regulations that would allow us to implement the law. On private lands, the fossils belong to the landowner. You need to have their permission for removal. There's actually provisions in the law now, under PERPRA, the law I just mentioned, that if you move them out of state, the landowner, without the landowner's permission, you can actually be prosecuted under that. In-river fossils, except petrified wood, which I'll get to at the end of this, can be collected in reasonable amounts for personal use. Well, the law actually is going to define that as 50 pounds per year. I don't know how they're going to enforce that or why, except I think it's probably a Park Service requirement. Unless otherwise specified, and Brenda brought this up with the fossil cycad that they are not going to allow that to be open for collection. And we can do that. I know there are a few other places in BLM. There are some tribal-like localities in Utah that have some really amazing trilobites that people like to study. In Montana, there's actually some fossil fish that are protected by that. We issue permits to educational institutions and museums. Although everything removed still belongs to the federal government, occasionally we have to ask for it back. Basically, it's the person doing it has either not followed the requirements in their permit, the museum's gone out of business. We've had this actually happen in West Virginia. A company that used to collect out, or a university decided they were going to get out of the paleontology business altogether, and so we had to go get their collections from Shenandoah Museum, I believe. Next. And of course, the other question is, if I find something, what do I do? Basically, I would take a picture. If you have a GPS unit, take a location. That provides us assistance, particularly if it's really significant. Basically, the less disturbance, the better. We will try to get out there to look. If you have a map with you, mark down where you were. Make sure where you were. We've actually had this come up a couple of times where private collectors have asked us to go out to GPS localities to make sure they're not on BLM. And the other thing, probably the most important thing, is find somebody who can tell you what you have. A lot of times they can do that from a picture, particularly if it's a good one, or they may want to go back. But you also tend to get credit. Homer was named for Burpee supporter. We have another site named the 3L site. One of their directors was out there. Ernie, the crocodile I showed, the Brachiochompsosaur I showed, that was named for a backhoe operator who helped them move over. Next. And petrified wood, I said I was getting back to this. Why is petrified wood treated differently than other kinds of plants and animal fossils? Well, really it goes back to the Southwest, where people were doing essentially what they did at Fossil Cycad. They were moving all the petrified wood from Petrified Wood National Monument at the time. So basically they came up with some regulations. You're allowed 25 pounds per day in one piece, but a maximum of 250 pounds a year. Don't ask me how. I don't think that's ever, I don't know if anybody enforcing that. Has to be for personal use rather than commercial use. Although you can actually file a claim as a gravel pit to mine petrified wood.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
That's one of the things. Can't be used removing heavy equipment if you're doing it for personal use. And the other piece over 250 pounds, they're considered museum pieces because they usually go on display. And what usually happens with those is you can get a free use permit to do it, and actually if you're building a church in Utah, you can do it. It's another piece of regulation.
Oh, wow.
Okay, does anybody have any questions for me? I went through this pretty fast, but yes, sir.
Is there a cost for those permits?
For the free use permits?
Yeah.
Generally not. We generally would issue them to police people like counties or things like that, so we generally don't. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You said that the different dinosaurs, they name them. Do they know whether it was male or female, or are they just guessing?
Sometimes they're guessing. Usually if they find the pelvis, that'll give them a really good idea of whether it's male or female. And sometimes the size will do it. There's actually sexual dimorphism between male and female, some female and male dinosaurs. And they found enough of them together so to sort of give them an idea. But for Jane, for example, Jane, even though she's named Jane, they're really not sure what sex she is. Yes, ma'am.
There are dinosaurs and, mammals found that are fossilized, but has there ever been any fossilized, like, arachnids, giant arachnids found?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Oh.
And in fact, actually, a person working over, Nate Carroll from the Carter County Museum in Ecoaka has actually found some insect bits in some of the amber out of the Hell Creek, which is something we haven't looked at or for, but I suspect we probably will be told that we will be from now on. But you do get pieces, you don't get, I can't think of anything like a tarantula, but you do get pieces of insects, and actually some really big ones. Yes, sir.
Well, I've got a question. Question dealing with the cycads. Have they ever done a survey as to what is still there?
We pulled some funding aside 2 years ago for the fossil cycad site, and we were hoping to get some School of Mines students out there to do a survey. Instead, the funding went towards trying to track down some of these collections, previous collections. But we've got earmarked projects for the next couple of years to try to get some funding for on-the-ground surveys. We had a group, I'm trying to think. At the School of Mines, there's a professor there now, and her name is Sally. Do you know Sally at all? I'll have to get you her name, but at any rate, she took a group of students out this last year during the 2015 field season, and they were able to identify some fossil cycads on site, and the students did produce a report on that. So there's been a little bit of survey done by the School of Mines, but we haven't had anything formal done yet, and we're hoping to do that in the next couple of years.
Have they found much up in the Black Hills?
The Black Hills, there were some marine fossils that I've seen in the limestone. But as far as actual vertebrate material in the Black Hills, I don't know that I don't think the formations are right, are they, Doug?
I don't believe so. I think they're, actually around the edges you might in the Pierre Shale, you can get things like mosasaurs and mosasaurs, which are they're a reptile, a marine reptile, kind of like a shark, plesiosaur type thing. You get those rarely, but you can find them. But I don't think of the actual Black Hills. I think it's actually limestone, and it's older limestone that you do not get.
I've seen a lot of shells, maybe a little bit of fish material coming out of the limestone, but I haven't seen any actual fossils.
I do have,
We know.
the Deadwood Formation, which is profiled in Deadwood, does have, of course, that's Cambrian in age, so there are some trilobites
Okay.
in that. But, of course, most of the hills is metamorphic or igneous, and you're not going to find anything in that. So.
They all hung out at Ormond Dam. Pierre Shale up there, there's shark's teeth, there's mosasaurs, there's all kinds of marine fossils up around that area. And I've got an example up here on the table of, there's a site, it's called the Battle Creek Dam site. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's north of Belfouche, out in the middle of absolute nowhere in Butte County. But this is a Ducks Unlimited dam that they put in the 90s. And I was out there, we're going to do some reconstruction on that dam, because believe it or not, the wind has beat the face to death and it needs some work. Anyway, I was out there doing a survey a year before last at the Battle Creek Dam, and this is pretty close to the Harding County line. And I found all kinds of marine fossils. This was 2 years ago, right after the flooding that happened up there, and there were all kinds of fish fossils, all kinds of baculites. I found a vertebrae that I'm just going to call it a mosasaur because I'm not really sure, but it's a fish vertebrae that's about this big. Anyway, they were everywhere. Now you go out there and you can't hardly find a thing, but I just happened to get lucky and I was out there at the right time.
Up at the old Catholic I'm not a native of the area, but I did notice up at the old Catholic cemetery here in Sturgis, there's a grotto that's mostly made out of petrified wood, and there's some rose quartz on it. And then I've seen it in, other people have built little fences and things out of all this petrified wood, and I'm wondering if anyone knows where all that came from. Must have been local.
I'm gonna guess North Dakota. No, I'm just kidding. Petrified wood can be found here in Meade County. I've seen it in Butte County. I've seen it in Harding County. The Badlands. We've got Fall River County down by Hot Springs. We've got petrified wood in most of western South Dakota. And I've seen some really big chunks of it in western North Dakota. I'm sure Doug's got tons of it in Montana.
We do, actually, across the border, we have, almost looks like a little forest. The only thing, it's in the Pierre Shale Formation, so we're wondering what it's doing out in the middle of the ocean.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
The hilltop out in Blacksburg, out across from the National Cemetery. The hilltop in Blacksburg, it has a lot of petrified wood in it. It did have, I think there still is, because it's not been exposed, but some of that was exposed when they were building houses a number of years ago.
Sure.
Whole logs 8 foot high.
Really? That's neat.
And then there's a petrified forest down there by Tilford and things that are full of the petrified wood, so there's
Yeah.
quite a bit on that rim of the hills out east.
Yeah, so I guess there's petrified wood. Have you been to that site yet down by Tilford, the petrified forest?
No.
Oh, you need to go there. It's exciting. It's like you're stepping back in time. It's a really neat place to go. Thank you.
The cycads are concentrated in hot springs. If the dinosaurs were eating it, that's right. How come it hasn't migrated to different locations?
The cycads?
Yeah. If the dinosaurs were eating it as food, why, like bird droppings, why didn't it migrate to a different location, the cycad?
Doug, can you talk to that? I'm going to guess that the cycads, we just happen to have really good preservation there at the fossil cycad site. Cycads, have they found cycads elsewhere?
They actually have found some cycads. That was one of the reasons that also got it unconsidered as a national monument, because they actually found cycads in other places, and so they said they weren't quite as unique as they were originally made out to be. We get some up in Montana and pieces of the Hell Creek. Usually not very good. You can kind of tell. The paleobotanists tell me they're cycads. I'm not sure. Any other questions? Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you.